Peace, peace, peace. You already know what it is. It's your boy. Y'all should be getting used to the pace by now that we moving at. Um, Popping in and out here and there. I got a book. I've been reading this book slowly. The history of the people of Trinidad and Tobago. I'll be trying to come up with topics that I think is still interesting to me. Things that are still mysteries to me. Things that I need to uncover and discover. And one of them is, history of my people in the islands. I've been kind of breaking it down on both sides of my family, putting a story together, and I think I got a pretty good idea. Um, However, there's still more to learn, more to uncover, more to discover, and I don't know everything. I could learn a little bit more. And I think we got to go back to making it cool to be intelligent without being arrogant, and try to be humble. Uh, as a man, sometimes being humble is difficult because other people perceive it as a sign of weakness or an unwillingness to engage in combat. But that aside, I'm just giving that psyche, giving you guys my psyche. That aside, I got the book by Eric Williams, History of the People of Trinidad and Tobago. This is going to focus on France and Spain and their roles in the island. And yeah, get back to doing live streams. I've been kind of bored lately. Like, like the live streams on YouTube are just kind of boring to me. Not really teaching me anything. Same old topics. So I could look at this as a fresh start, new beginning, and go about things a certain way that makes sense to me. Um, Part of me really would like to do this pre-recorded rather than doing it live, because I feel like once there's an audience, there's a feeling like you need to perform, and I really just rather learn in a genuine fashion and try to answer some of these mysteries that still remain when it comes to the past. um, Really, when I think of France in the Caribbean, I would think of somewhere like San Domingue. I think that's what it's called, San Domingue. Um, Haiti, um, and then Spain. We would think of like Dominican Republic, Puerto Rico, uh, etc. So this is just gonna be a read. We're just gonna read, man. That's all it is. I'm gonna be taking notes. I got my sticky notes. I got the book ready. I got a nice quiet setting. I got a nice candle lit. Made sure I wiped down the table and got it all clean and made some space. I got the plants around me. I got grapes around me. You know what I'm saying? Probably I need to grab a damn fish tank or something. You know what I'm saying? Get a nice fish tank in here. And then it'd really be a vibe. We're going to be vibing out. I'm going to let the music play for a second. Take a brief intermission. Share the stream. Like the stream. And then we're going to go into this story, this history, briefly. So with that being said, you guys know I like to build a routine and play the same instrumental. And I'll be right back in a minute or two. Actually, I'm going to switch it up. Let's do this one. I'm ready. I'm ready. Chapter 5. We are on chapter 5. Let's see this. Chapter 5 begins like this. Africa had been brought in by Spain into Trinidad. Hold on. Africa had been brought in by Spain into Trinidad and the West Indies as the solution of the labor problem. It's very important. You know, I wish I didn't value the physical nature of these books because I would just write in the damn book. But that very first sentence is very important. We have a labor problem in the Caribbean. So Spain says, we're going to grab some Africans. So you got the Caribbean. Let me set this up. I'm taking my notes. Okay. We got the Caribbean islands. And there's work that needs to be done. For the Spaniards. We got to get a timeline on this. Okay, I'm seeing a date as well coming up in the next couple sentences. So the labor source is going to be Africans. France was now brought into Trinidad as the solution of the problem of white management. What does that mean? France was now brought into Trinidad as the solution of the problem of white management. A French planter from Grenada, Room de Saint Laurent, visited Trinidad and submitted a memorandum to the King of France on March 20th, 1777. The result of this memorandum was to transform a backward Amerindian colony governed by Spain into a Spanish colony run by Frenchmen and worked by African slaves. So on one side, you got Spain, and the French are accusing them of poorly managing the island. So Spain on one side, you got France on the other side. Okay. The result of this memorandum was to transform a backward Amerindian colony governed by Spain into a Spanish colony run by Frenchmen and worked by African slaves. The proposals of Room de Saint Laurent were designed to facilitate the immigration of French planters into Trinidad. My question is, these French planters, are they slaves? Are these French planters slaves? In effect, they amounted to the setting up of a French state within a Spanish state. There was nothing singular in such a condominium in a single island, either in fact or in law. In 1685, Brandenburg, one of the states in the German Confederation, had agreed with the Danes in St. Thomas in the Virgin Islands for the lease of an area in St. Thomas for the employment of 200 slaves. That's very interesting. I got to read that again. In 1685, Brandenburg, which is one of the states in the German Confederation. So Brandenburg had agreed with the Danes. So you got Germans and people from Denmark, who are in St. Thomas in the Caribbean, which is in the Virgin Islands, to lease an area. So lease some land. So use it for a portion of time. In St. Thomas for the employment of 200 slaves. Okay, so they're showing they're showing the, I guess, economic and political discourse and relationship of the European states amongst each other during the early colonial periods in the Caribbean islands. This is very interesting. Very, very, very interesting to slow down and think about what this is actually saying. Some good information. For some 70 years before the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713, or Utrecht in 1713, English and French jointly occupied the island of St. Kitts. Even today, the tiny island, I lost my spot. The tiny island of St. Martin is shared between France and Holland. I did not know that. That is very interesting. So let me get my note, because I got a good note for this. Things you would not know. So what we're seeing is, we'll have an island that is shared, we'll just call it sharing amongst nations. And I'm not going to leave out money. I'll put some dollar signs. And there's also labor. This is capitalism, economics. And then it gives us some examples. So to this day, in St. Martin, you have 2 European countries that share the island, France and Holland. The essence of the plan of Rome de Saint Laurent was the transfer of as many planters as possible and their African slaves from the French islands of Martinique, Guadeloupe, Dominica, St. Lucia, St. Vincent, and Grenada. I got to read that over again. The essence of the plan of Rome de Saint Laurent was the transfer of as many planters as possible. Okay, so I understand what it's saying now. From the French islands, okay. He emphasized that all of them suffered more or less from a variety of hardships. Hurricanes, ants, which destroyed the sugar crop, bankruptcy, debts, and the low price of coffee, and soil exhaustion. Oh, you lived? I didn't know you lived in St. Martin. Yeah, okay. I don't really know anything about St. Martin, to tell you the truth. I don't think I know anything about St. Martin. I don't even think I've met anyone from St. Martin. But it's a French island along with Martinique, Guadeloupe, Dominica, St. Lucia, St. Vincent, and Grenada. Where did I leave off? He was afraid. Okay, so right now we're talking about Rome de Saint Laurent. In Rome de Saint Laurent is a Frenchman that was planting in Grenada, so running a business in Grenada. and he visits Trinidad and writes a memorandum to Spain telling them how poorly managed the Trinidadian island is. So what this is getting into, the title of the chapter is Spain Reigns, but France Governs. All right, where are we? So Room de Saint Laurent was afraid that the British mainland colonies of North America would offer such incentives to these planters that they would migrate to populate the states of Georgia, Carolina, and Florida. So now we're seeing competition between different nations to attract migrants. I shouldn't even say migrants, but yeah, to attract migrants and businessmen. So I'm going to read that again. It says, Room de Saint Laurent was afraid that the British mainland colonies of North America would offer such incentives to these planters that they would migrate to populate the states of Georgia, Carolina, and Florida. Okay, so what planters? He's talking about the planters and their African slaves from the French islands. Saint Laurent estimated that some 383 white families would be interested in these proposals. Of these, 286 were from Martinique, 40 from Dominica, and 57 from Grenada. Allowing 4 persons to a family, this meant a possible addition to the white population of Trinidad of 1,532 persons. These would bring with them a total of 33,322 African slaves, of whom 24,710 were in Martinique, 3,647 in Dominica, and 4,965 in Grenada. The very first glimpse of the possible development of Trinidad involved, in other words, migration from the neighboring small islands. The Spanish government accepted the proposals of Room de Saint Laurent. On November 20th, 1783, the King of Spain issued the famous Cedula of Population opening Trinidad's doors under certain conditions to foreign immigrants. The terms of the Cedula summarized were as follows. The foreigners must be Roman Catholics and subjects of nations in alliance with Spain. That's not really surprising. We see policies like that today. They must take an oath of allegiance to Spain and agree to abide by the Spanish laws. Every white immigrant, male or female, would receive 4 fanegas and 2/7 of land. In addition, half of the quantity for each slave introduced by him. Free Negroes and people of color would receive half of the quantity of land assigned to whites, with an additional half for each slave introduced by them. So I know that could be something that people say, oh, wait. So I'm going to slow that one down and read it again. Let's read that one again. Free Negroes and people of color would receive half the quantity of land assigned to whites, with an additional half for each slave introduced by them. After 5 years residence in Trinidad, the settlers and their children would have all the rights and privileges of naturalization, including eligibility for public office and posts in the militia. No head tax or personal tribute would be imposed upon the settlers at any time, except that after 10 years, they would each pay an annual sum of $1 for each Negro or colored slave with the guarantee that this sum would never be augmented. The settlers would be free from the payment of tithes on the produce of their lands for 10 years, beginning January 1st, 1785, after which they would pay only one half tithe, that is to say 5%. For the first 10 years, the settlers would be free from the payment of the royal duty from the sales of their produce and merchantable effects, after which they would pay only 5%, but all their exports shipped to Spain in Spanish vessels would be forever exempt from any duty on exportation. Number 10, all vessels belonging to the settlers, whatever their tonnage or make, would be registered in Trinidad and accounted Spanish vessels, as well as the vessels acquired from foreigners by purchase or legal title before the end of the year 1786. Number 11, the Negro slave trade would be totally free of duties for a period of 10 years, reckoned from the beginning of the year 1785, after which the settlers would pay only 5% on the current value of slaves at the time of their importation. The settlers would be permitted under government license to go to the West Indian Islands in alliance with Spain, or to neutral islands to procure slaves on the understanding that only Spanish ships would be used. Number 13, for 10 years, computed from the beginning of the year 1785, Spanish subjects would be free to make voyages to Trinidad with their cargoes direct from ports of France in which Spanish consuls are resident, and to return direct to those ports with the products of Trinidad, except money, the exportation of which was absolutely prohibited by that route. Wow, this list is 21 items on this list. And I'm just going to have to go through it because there's information in every one of these. Deep stuff. Okay, 14. The royal offices in Caracas were instructed to purchase on the king's account and transport to Trinidad black cattle, mules, and horses, and to sell them to the settlers at prime cost until such time as they had sufficient stock to supply themselves. Number 15. Similar instructions were issued with respect to the supply of flour and meal to Trinidad for a period of 10 years. 16. All Spanish manufacturers needed by the settlers for their agriculture were to be imported into Trinidad and sold to the settlers at prime cost during a period of 10 years. 17. 2 priests of known erudition and exemplary virtue and expert in foreign languages were to be appointed to Trinidad to act as parish priests to the new settlers. So this is very interesting. He's given the whole layout of how they established the island. Very important information. So this is France. Hold on, let me see. This is France, and this is initiated by the French planter Room de Saint Laurent. So I gotta, maybe I'll pause for a second and see what information I can find on Room de Saint Laurent. Room de Saint Laurent. There's manuscripts. I'm seeing we have some manuscripts. Now, okay, you have to, okay. This library with the manuscripts is in Trinidad. So it's not, I don't understand why these things aren't made like fully accessible. It doesn't make sense to me at all. This is crazy, but you know what? This archive, this platform right here, let me see, I'm gonna put it in the chat. Looks like it'll have a lot of old manuscripts. That one right there. That's the site that I'm on. I can't see the actual manuscript. You would have to call in to get access to it. Part of the Alma Jordan Library, the University of the West Indies repository, and then it gives a link to the library. Okay, I see what this website is. So this website, it basically is like a hub for. It looks like archived documents. So yeah, I'm gonna go to its collections. It has a bunch of stuff. It's not even really just one dimensional. It has so many different things in here. So it looks like it's even like a search engine if you wanted to find documents. But again, I don't understand why all of this stuff just isn't openly accessible. It doesn't make sense to me. Like, what is the purpose of like? Well, I guess it's the only answer I could think of why this stuff would be prevented from being so accessible is for economic purposes. Like, oh, purchase it instead. Or if you are not a part of if you're not a part of the country or the city where the investment has been made into these resources, then you can't get access into it. That's basically what it is. But yeah, that's ridiculous. All right. Where am I at? Number 18. The settlers were permitted to propose to the king, through the governor, such ordinances as were necessary for regulating the treatment of their slaves and preventing their flight. So now we're getting into laws pertaining to the management and governance of slaves. Number 19. The governor was to take the utmost care to prevent the introduction of ants into Trinidad. 20. When the cultivation of sugar had become fully expanded in Trinidad, the settlers were to be allowed to establish refineries in Spain with all the privileges and freedom from duties previously extended to Spaniards or foreigners. All I'm hearing is economics. But what happens is now this economic conversation has to include morality. They wanted to prevent the ants because they were destroying the sugar crops. What was I just saying before that? So you got economics in the islands. That's all I'm seeing is economic activity. Well, that's not all I'm seeing, because it becomes a question of morality. Is it right to be using slave labor? Is it right to have just conquered a land of foreign people? But that question, it still applies even on a micro level. A lot of times we don't speak about, the wars amongst the people themselves. When one foreign group gets introduced, now that group creates a context where they're the outsiders. But if you're on the island of Trinidad and you're an American Indian tribe from one side, and you go raid and conquer another American Indian tribe on the other side, that in principle is the same thing that happened when the Spaniards came and conquered the entire island. So a lot of times the part of the conversation that gets ignored is the things that happened on the micro level. Um, but yeah, the question of morality has to come into play. And then you got to have a micro and macro perspective on it. We only talk about the macro. We don't really talk about the micro perspective. Because on a micro perspective, people have started to bring this up, more recently. In the micro perspective, you also have to discuss and talk about the activity on the African continent and the West African region prior to the transatlantic slave trade and during, because there were things that took place on a micro level that made it possible for the macro to happen, which is the transatlantic slave trade. But we only really talk about the transatlantic slave trade. In fact, a lot of Pan-African channels, again, a critique I would give is it's almost like in a willing ignorance of the quote unquote black reality that was present, that made it possible for foreigners or Europeans to do what ended up happening. Another thing that people don't talk about that I humbly was discussing was European history and what they actually did to each other. What they actually did to each other is what they duplicated in other places. But we don't actually talk about the fact that they did it amongst themselves before they left and did it to Africans. But because our conversations is so centered around race, we only care about the macro, which is the racial aesthetic part of it. Like, oh, we see white do it to black, but there's no conversation about black doing it to black. There's no conversation about white doing it to white before they did it to the black. And you could bring that to modern day context, where this is a slight tangent. Black Lives Matter movement was hijacked by white people. And black people also have to bear responsibility in this, because within that movement was an uproar and anger response to black people being murdered, persecuted by white police officers. But the criticism comes where there's black people that are dying from gun violence and other means to other black people. And why is not Black Lives Matter a part of that conversation? Because the black life should matter whether it's assaulted by a white or a black. The principle should be the preservation and the respect for the black life, not just when a white person does something wrong to them. So that's another example of the micro and the macro. What else can we get from this? What number is this? Number 20. When the cultivation of sugar had become fully expanded in Trinidad, the settlers were to be allowed to establish refineries in Spain with all the privileges and freedoms from duties previously extended to Spaniards or foreigners. The settlers would enjoy the privilege of, number 21, the settlers would enjoy the privilege of directing representations to the king through the medium of the governor and the general secretary of state for the Indies. So, okay. All right. So I'm trying to, let me just keep reading because I want to hear more about this relationship between France and Spain. I understand what they're doing on the island, and I understand the economic portion of it, but I want to hear more about this relationship between the two countries. This, in modern parlance, was the first set of incentives offered in Trinidad to attract foreign capital. It constituted a confession of the total failure of the Spanish colonialism. The Spanish exclusive could be maintained only inclusive of France. The Spanish exclusive could be maintained only inclusive of France. Okay, I understand what that means. The Spanish exclusive, to explain it, is, from what I remember, it had something to do with them not allowing foreigners to embark on their colonies. The Spanish was not having any foreigners having any, like, once they locked down the land, they wanted everybody out. This is ours. No foreign nothing. No France, no Denmark, no nobody else. So that's the whole concept of the Spanish exclusive. So now it's saying the Spanish exclusive could be maintained only inclusive of France. So now France is simply like stepping right into the picture. Not content, the Spanish government went further a little more than 2 years later. On January 30th, 1786, another decree amended the cedula of colonization and liberalized the incentives. The 5% in lieu of tithes and the 5% royal duty on the sale of their products, which the settlers were to pay after 10 years, were reduced to 2.5%. The time for naturalizing foreign-built merchant vessels was extended from 1786 to 1788. The exemption from duty on the importation of Negro slaves was extended from 10 years and made perpetual. And the duty of 5%, which the settlers were to pay after 10 years, was forever abolished. Instead of paying 5% on all produce exported to foreign countries for the purpose of purchasing slaves, they were to pay only 3%. The duty on the export of produce to France was similarly reduced from 5% to 3%. And a similar reduction was made on all produce exported for the purpose of purchasing flour whenever there was a scarcity in the islands. This liberal policy was followed by permission of the King of Spain to the governor of Trinidad on April 20th, 1790, to raise from any European nation whatsoever a loan in the sum of 1 million, on condition that it would be repaid from the value of the crops in their plantations. This, Trinidad's first loan on the world market, was proof that colonial development could not be achieved under the umbrella of any one country, and was in fact a condemnation of the very foundation on which European colonialism had rested up to that date. It compares favorably with the uproar raised in the House of Commons in 1772, when a proposal was first mooted to permit foreign investment in the West Indian territories acquired by Britain from France at the Peace of Paris in 1763. Wow, this starts to get into I want to say like a census. This stuff gets very, very deep. Very deep. The cedula of colonization virtually coinciding with the arrival in Trinidad of its most distinguished governor, Don Jose Maria Chacon, was the signal for an unprecedented development of the Trinidadian economy. as well as an unprecedented initiative on the part of the governor of Trinidad. Chacon himself, a man of no mean intellectual gifts and administrative ability, proceeded to reorganize the ineffective government which he had inherited. One of his first and most important measures was his reorganization in 1787 of the administrative divisions of the colony, which he divided into three parts with a commissioner of population in charge of each. The three divisions were as follows. The first, Las Cuevas, Salibia, Guanapo, Tacarigua, Laventil, St. Anne's, Tragaret, Maraval, Diego Martin, Carnarje, virtually the limits of the present county of St. George. The second, Naparima, Galeota, Cocal, and Guatero. The third, Guapo, Las Gallos, and Guayare. These comprehensive regulations, as expanded in 1788, are a good example of Spanish paternalism. The first responsibility of the commissioners of population was a census of population. Yes, that's what I thought I saw. So I did see that. Distinguishing free men from slaves, identifying class and national origin. So now in 1788, so that would imply prior to 1788, those things were not being noted. Those things were not being documented. So that's important. You got 1788. Now they're actually starting to manage the island better. So we get the census. And the census is going to talk about national origin. The census is going to talk about class. And it's going to talk about status. 1788. Anyone changing his estate or plantation was required to notify the commissioners, who had to submit a statement of the population to the governor in December of each year, noting the births and the deaths in that year. So now we're getting birth records, death records, starting, or at least intended to be kickstarted by 1788. The second responsibility of the commissioners related to agriculture. They were to ascertain the area of land cleared, the area cultivated, the crops grown, the yield of these crops, the labor and machinery employed on plantations. They were to measure and survey each plantation and to verify all litigation, past and pending. No land was to be alienated or sold without notice to the commissioners. The third responsibility of the commissioners related to the roads. The commissioners were to prepare plans for the course of royal roads, to estimate their costs, and to recommend the means to be employed. They were to ensure that planters planted lime trees, trees of Campeche wood, or other useful trees, interspersed with orange and other fruits, on other fruit trees. on the part of their estate bordering a public road, so as to delight the eye and temper the heat of the sun for the relief of travelers. Twice a year, the commissioners were to arrange for the clearing and repairs of roads, distributing the work among the planters according to the number of slaves belonging to each, the quantity of land owned, and the frontage on each public road. The policing of the island was the commissioners' fourth responsibility. They were to take cognizance of all robberies, quarrels, and disorders. The commissioners, in the fifth place, were to pay special attention to the governors of the slaves. They were to prevent inhumanity to and ill treatment of the slaves, to ensure that each plantation grew an adequate quantity of provisions for the maintenance of the slaves, and to note particularly all offenses involving slave and master or slave and freeman. Okay, so the commissioner has a number of responsibilities. Let's get this. The commissioners. One of his first and most important measures was his reorganization in 1787 of the administrative divisions of the colony, which he divided into three parts with the commissioner. So who did this? Chacon, governor. Okay, so the governor Chacon, appoints the commissioner with certain duties. This pen isn't really working. There we go. So the Governor Chacon, appoints the commissioner with the duties concerning agriculture. You got agriculture. You got roads. The census. And I know it says something about the governance of slaves, yeah. Policing. Slave master relations. All right, so that was the governor's responsibility that was the commissioner's responsibility under the governor. One can well understand what Chacon meant when he decreed that the commissioners were to know with the greatest exactitude the lands in their respective divisions. So he wants them on top of their job. And this is, let me see, is he French or Spanish? His name is Spanish, Don Jose Maria Chacon. Okay. Chacon's second major reform was, in a proclamation of July 27, 1785, the removal of some of the confusion relating to land grants and land titles. All lands which had not been alienated by a formal concession were declared crown lands. All right, so I don't even want this stream to go too long because this information gets deep. I'm going to break this stream right there. I may come back after a brief break. I may stay on this topic. I may switch the topic and go into another book, but I'm gonna halt the stream right there.